I'm here to talk about the early women. My sobriety date is May 13th, 1978. I got sober in Akron, Ohio, and fell in love, just fell in love. And then I found out it was the birthplace of AA. And this thing that I love so much, I was walking right in the grounds where they once walked. So I am so grateful to be here. Now let me gear up my talk here so we can get started. Okay, so for so many years, and you know what I love about this? I get to share with no time limit. I don't know how you felt about that last week, Tom, but it's so nice to not have to play while you're giving a talk to be trying to fit it into a clock. Yeah, me too. So I'm gonna enjoy this a whole lot more than I usually do when I'm working with that time frame. So how important is it for us to recognize and celebrate our heroes and our sheroes? We talked about Bob and Bill over and over again. And when I started doing this work, which I'll tell you a little briefly about the history here, no one knew anything about the women. We didn't talk about the women. This is a good old boy program, and we talked about the good old boys. And so, girls, we hadn't burned our bras yet. So we were so in the background in the 30s. So, all right, we're going to do it this way. So after I got sober in 78, I got active, and I was on the intergroup board, and I was asked to host Lois Wilson at Founders Day. And I didn't know anything about hosting anybody. And because I said yes to whatever you're asked to do in AA, that yes led to me meeting Lois and her companions, because she came into Founders Day that year with several of the people she traveled with. One of those people being Nell Wing. And there you see a picture of Nell Wing in the back of the car there, an unbelievable soul. And so I was challenged to seat her. Lois came in with Barry. So Barry and Lois sat up on the dais. And I wanted Lois, she was so frail and so fragile. I wanted her to be able to see her companions. So I sat them down right in front of her. And there just happened to be an empty seat. And so I ended up sitting down with Nell. And while I'm talking to her, she's sharing with me that she was with Bill when he wrote the 12 and 12, and that she was his secretary, and just totally, she loved to share. And I'm like a cartoon character where my eyes kind of rolled in the back of my head, I'm like, oh my God, look who I'm talking to. And I got so grateful. And I said, well, Nell, if there's ever anything I can do for you, just ask. And she said, well, yes, Gail, there is. You could start an archives. Now, I didn't get up that day thinking that I'm a historian or an archivist. I had done nothing but turn my life and my will over, was waiting for my assignment, sort of like Mission Impossible. I kind of thought God would call me up and give me that mission, And there it was, a request from Nell Wing, who I thought just might know a little bit about AA, asking me to do something for Alcoholics Anonymous. So I guess I did my best to try to do that, but it wasn't too easy because Akron wasn't too interested in an archives. They thought carrying the message was working at St. Thomas Hospital, or 12-step work was the work. The work was not caring for the history, and we hadn't cared for it. There wasn't much around left because there were people that were interested in it, that were getting it, and it was leaving town as fast as they could find it. That made it very challenging. The fact that Akron wasn't too concerned about it, and most of it was already gone. Let me just tell you briefly, we're going to talk about Nell Wing a little bit today, and as you get to know her, I hope you can fall in love with her like I did. She was non-alcoholic. You do not have to be alcoholic to be an archivist or a historian for Alcoholics Anonymous. But she was Bill's secretary for a long time, and then she would open the GSO archives at the request of Bill Wilson. She was a true friend of AA and a companion to Bill and Lois. She was like Gal Friday to Bill, traveled with him through all that history, wrote a book, Grateful to Have Been There, that you can get what her eyes saw during that time, and dearly, dearly, dearly loved Lois Wilson. She even had a bedroom at the house at Stepping Stone. She had her own bedroom, but she would go there a lot and help Bill with his writing. And do crossword puzzles with Lois. So after Nell asked me if I'd be an archivist, I ended up getting involved in the purchase of Dr. Bob's home. I had always wanted to buy the home, but I didn't think it would be very good for an alcoholic ego to own Dr. Bob's home. It might threaten my sobriety. And I talked it up, and we couldn't figure out how to do it. So it had been sold in 1952, and it had gone through many, many hands of drug dealers, motorcycle people, rentals, and was now in the possession of a student at Akron University. And I was asked to make a cold call on that guy, which I did cold call, and ended up negotiating the purchase and bringing back a contract, which is a whole nother story. But now I think I can do that. I can put the archives in Dr. Bob's house. So, by the way, there was 12 steps on the way up to the door there. We didn't put them in just for tourists. But I ended up calling up Nell, still not knowing how to be an archivist, but thinking in my head, oh, we have the house. I can put the archives in the house. I'll have everything I need. I'll have money. I'll have support. I'll have the ability to do this. And I stayed with Nell. I called Nell up. Nell invited me into her home. I actually lived with Nell during my spring break and went out to visit Lois. And what I learned was you can't put an AA archives into Dr. Bob's house. Dr. Bob's house is not AA. And that was really a hard concept in the early days for us to get. We just thought, well, it's Dr. Bob's house, so therefore it's AA. And she said, Gail, if you want to be an AA archivist, you can't do that. The purpose of the home is not to put an AA archives in there. The purpose of the home would be to put the Smith history in there. And I came back to Akron with that news, and nobody was very happy to hear that. So I ended up leaving the home because I was going to put it under the 3 legacies. I chose the 3 legacies at that time over a foundation. So this was part of my visit out to see, out to learn how to do it, because Stepping Stones was going to be my example at that time. And so I'm here with Nell in the living room of Stepping Stones, and I'm going to have a drink with Lois, which is a cup of coffee. And yes, I am sober in that picture, but my hair hadn't sobered up yet. I can't believe I show you that, but it's to prove that Nell was probably my first service sponsor at that time. And so after I broke away, I kind of wandered for about 10 years trying to get Akron to have some interest in its history, which was a very tough sell. They didn't know what it was. It was a New York idea, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, after 10 years, they offered me an old room in this building here, and it got converted into an archives. I hope if you come to Akron, you will visit that. There are 26 displays around the archives that explain it, and then a beautiful interior with all the artifacts in it. So please come and please visit that. But the purpose of this story today that's just a little of my background, is to talk about what I call this story, the women behind the men. They were in the background, and I'm going to be bringing them out because this is the year 2025, so we need to bring them out. So another title for this could have been Dr. Bob and the Good Old Gals. Another title could have been Tales of the Frails. Dr. Bob called women frails. And then we always talk about his story. So today we're going to talk about her story. And here comes Dr. Bob now. It's just a great picture of Bob with these nurses from the city hospital where he interned and later worked. And the nurses just loved him. I've talked to nurses that knew Dr. Bob, and they told me that they used to sniff his breath to see if he was drinking or not. So they were sniffers too. The story that I'm going to tell you today starts out in a church in Keswick, England. And Frank Buchman, the founder of the Oxford Group, has got resentments. I know you find that hard to believe, but he did. And he was over there working through some stuff, and he entered this little church for a revival meeting. And a woman enters our story at that point. Her name was Jessie Penn Lewis. So here he is in the church listening to Jessie Penn Lewis speak, and she's going to be talking about the cross. And he got a vision of a cross, just a vision. And he saw that our relationship with God gets crossed out, by the ego. And that night, Frank Buchman wrote amends letters. So if any of you wondered where we got amends, that's where our amends come from, that moment and that experience. Now, that experience was a spiritual religious experience that actually changed him. And he started a movement called the Oxford Group. In Akron, Harvey Firestone had several sons, and one of them is going to get sober in the Oxford Group. And he is like the prodigal son story. He is so grateful that he is going to want Akron to meet the Oxford Group that changed his family and that was introduced to him. And so he's going to invite Akron. Like 6,000 people came to this deal. It was held in downtown Akron. And it was all the high society people. Society was very big back then. So you can see they're all dressed up. There's this big dinner, and it was held at the Mayflower Hotel. And Frank Buchman had come in with about 40 to 60 Oxford Group people because they traveled like an army for God. And they were teams. So this team had come to Akron. And by the way, the woman here that you see in this picture, it's the Firestone boy, Bud, that got sober, but this is a picture of his wife. And since we're talking about women, what a beautiful lady she was. And this was a lot of her ideas. She even did a women's meeting in Akron. So she was very prominent at this time in gratitude for her husband's recovery. And she played a part. So like I said, this is January of 1933. And this is the newly opened Mayflower Hotel. We all know about when Bill put a nickel in the phone in 1935, but this is another Mayflower story you might not have known about that happened in 33 that preceded Bill staying there. And they're going to hold a big dinner there, opening night for 400 people. And who gives testimony to his recovery from alcoholism but the Firestone's son, Bud? This is important for those of you that are trying to understand Akron in the 30s and why Akron became the birthplace. It starts with the drunk's recovery. And so, now this wasn't an AA meeting, but they did have testimony. And so apparently he's going to give some testimony at this. And then for the next 10 days, they're going to hold what was called house parties. Now, the meetings in the early days were structured like Oxford Group meetings, and they're going to hold meetings in the morning and at night. And then they'll go out into the pulpits of the churches. They're going to speak around town. And then they're going to have a group conscience, and some of them are going to stay and some of them are going to leave. And they begin holding meetings in Akron in homes. Now, you're looking at a picture here of Henrietta and Ann Smith. And early on, when the people were in town at the hotel, Henrietta and Ann attended some of those meetings, but not Dr. Bob. But they knew that Dr. Bob, there's a depression going on. A very important part of understanding the story is to understand the depression. There's a depression going on, and Bob's practice is nil, and he's suffering a lot. It's really a hard time in our country, a very dark time in our country when this light comes in. So here you see Dr. Bob, and he's pretty depressed, and but Ann and Henrietta twist his arm a little bit, like they were always behind the scenes, putting some mojo on Bob, and they get him to start attending Oxford Group meetings in these homes. And he actually likes the Oxford Group. And so he changes his mind about a lot of things. You know, when he was a young boy, he swore he'd never go back to church. He is so turned off by religion, just like Bill was. But he liked the Oxford Group people. They were kind of high society people in Akron. And they were it's like a meeting today. Have you ever heard the laughter and I call it the music of AA? people are basically in a spiritual program are pretty happy souls. So he was attracted to that. So he changed his mind and he began reading the Bible. He began going to meetings. He prayed a lot, read a lot of material from the Oxford group, even went back to church. That was huge. His mom used to put him to bed at 5 o'clock. And she was real church lady and forced him to go to church. And he had had enough of that, but he changed his mind. But no matter, even though the Oxford group basically has all of our principles except for step one, which was what was missing in this story. But he had those principles and he's practicing them. But I think it's real important to know in 2.5 years, Bob did not get sober. There was no singleness of purpose. Oxford group was all things to all people. And so things are bad. They're ready to foreclose on Dr. Bob's home. His practice is nil. His family life is a mess. And in 2.5 years, he can't get this thing. He told Henrietta, maybe I'm just a wannabe. My heart goes out to that. How many times have we tried to get sober? And how many times have we not kept that promise? How many times? And you'll see a thing in the Bible with Bill that it's really hard to keep facing the powerlessness of not being able to recover from alcohol at that time. And there really was nothing. There wasn't anything available at that time, drying out places, but not much success. So let's take a look at the woman behind Dr. Bob Smith, Ann Smith. And what's important about Ann Smith is Bill will call her the mother of AA, but we never really talked too much about her until recently. So I'm really glad we're doing that. A beautiful soul, a little bit about her. She comes from Oak Park. It's just outside of Chicago. That's her family home. That's the same home that they were married in. Here she is, a younger picture of her with her brother. You don't see her usually that young. But here's when she's really young. I love this picture. How can you not love this picture? She looks so sweet in that picture. And I think Ann Smith might have been born sweet. She was a very special lady. Most of us have to work a 12-step program to even come close to Ann Smith. But as you can see here, she was adorable. Here she is as an older woman staring out the window. And when I see this picture, it always reminds me to tell you that I think she's waiting for Dr. Bob to sober up. You see, they courted for 17 years. And you might say Dr. Bob was a little slow. I guess after 17 years, he decides to make her his bride. And I think that was a time of sobriety for him because he was interning in Akron. Here's another picture of Ann, beautiful picture of her. So in 1915, they moved into Dr. Bob's home. By the way, they paid $4,000 for that home. Actually, I think it's that they buy the home in 1915, they move in 1916. And here's a picture of them as a couple. And I particularly like this picture. I had cut Ann out of this and dry mounted her on the fireplace in the home next door to Dr. Bob's house. And I was up in the office working, and I heard two newcomers down there saying, "Ooh, I didn't know the Queen Mum was in AA." And here she is. There's a picture of her. She looks just like the Queen of England there a little bit. So back to Dr. Bob. I don't know why this picture's in again, so we'll just move on. Okay, so he's depressed. And Henrietta gets a phone call from this woman, Delphine Weber. Another woman enters the picture. She was a member of the Oxford group that Dr. Bob was attending, only there was a problem with Bob and Ann. They weren't sharing. For those of you that are interested in what they were doing in the early days, sharing was important. Now, not necessarily about alcoholism, but sharing in general. And Bob and Ann weren't sharing. So she alerts Henrietta to that. And Henrietta did the important thing. As you learned to study what they were doing in meetings, what they were doing was something that created the whole story of Alcoholics Anonymous. As far as I'm concerned, it was this thing called the morning quiet time. So she asked God, What are we going to do about Dr. Bob? And there she is, a perfect picture of her in her morning meditation, quiet time, where they're praying, but they're listening as well. And here's her prayer. She's saying this to God, but I told Bob that I was sure if he lived this way of life, he could quit drinking. Now I need your help, God. And she believed she was going to get an answer. And she did. And the voice said, Bob must not touch one drop of alcohol. So she calls up Ann and she goes, Ann, I got guidance for Bob. I got guidance for Bob. And Ann tells Bob, Bob gets in the car, and the gate lodge is just down the street from them. And he jumps in his car and he goes down to get that guidance from Henrietta. And she tells him, don't touch a single drop of alcohol, Bob. He was very disappointed in that. He thought it'd be a bigger miracle than that. But think about that. That's the core of our whole program today. Stay away from the first drink. So, pretty profound answer in its simplicity. Henrietta goes into her guidance, and the most amazing part of this story, you see, there's no women sober running around at this time, and there won't be till 1939. So the women play an important part, and here's her really important part. She was so good at her quiet time, as was Ann Smith, which I'll tell you about. She was able to download intervention. But there's no, today, turn on your TV, there's a show called Intervention. But in 35, they know nothing about intervention. And yet, she downloads exactly what they did with Betty Ford in the early days of intervention. She calls up her friend T. Henry and Clarice, and you're looking at a home here, which was the very first group of Alcoholics Anonymous will end up meeting there. This is the home that she's going to ask them, can we use this home for a special meeting for Dr. Bob and Ann because they're not sharing, and we're going to get them to share. And they agreed to let them use their home. And one of the reasons for that is because of the Depression, they were foreclosing on homes, including Dr. Bob's home. I mean, people were ready to lose their homes. But then the banks had taken so many homes that there was this moratorium. And so right before they were going to take this house, they stopped taking homes. And so they felt that this house was God's house. So they said yes. Now, another important part of this downloading of this intervention that she did was to have what's called a setup meeting. The Oxford group had something called setup meetings, and she called for the setup meeting on a Monday. And she told the people that were meeting to do this intervention, come prepared to mean business. There's not going to be any pussyfooting around. We're going to share, and we're going to share deeply. And so they called that meeting for a Wednesday at 8:00. And so what happened at that meeting was they all went around the room as planned and shared something very costly to them, something that would help Dr. Bob be more comfortable. So when it became Dr. Bob's turn, he thanked them. And actually, it took place in this living room here. I want to set that setting for you as they all went around the room. And when it came Dr. Bob's turn, he thanked them. And he said, now at the cost of my profession, I am a secret drinker and I cannot stop. Step one. They then said something. T. Henry could mark the spot when he was living. He said, they all got down and they said, Dr. Bob, would you like us to pray for you? And he said, yes. And they all got down on their knees in that living room and prayed for Dr. Bob. That's when the miracle happened. Because it's going to be approximately 2 weeks after that. She's going to continue to pray for Bob every day in that quiet time. And so Bill's on a business trip to Akron. He's broke, but he's coming back because there's going to be this proxy takeover of National Rubber Machinery Shop. By the way, T. Henry worked for National Rubber Machinery Shop, and he lost his job there because of Bill Wilson's takeover. So that even made that home even more peril. for takeover because of Bill Wilson. It's quite a story. Now, anyway, he's going to be back down there in the newly opened Mayflower Hotel, and we know a little more about that story. There's a picture of the lobby there, but that's not where the story took place. If you look to the right of that alcove there, there's elevators to your right. And when Bill got off the elevator, that's where there were 3 bars in the hotel. If you stand in front of the elevator, to your left was the Parisian room, which is where that bar was making all those tinkly noises. And directly ahead would have been the directory. And so there's a picture of the bar. And I think there's a picture of the directory. You see it's in front of those. You have to walk through that alcove to get to the lobby. Okay, so he is tempted, as we all know, to go into the bar, but he's been working with alcoholics, and he's been talking to Dr. Silkworth. He's not been successful. So he needs this piece before he comes to Akron. These pieces kind of fall into place to create the story, just kind of like dominoes falling. And so he gets this message from Silkworth to quit preaching. And he also, at this point, it's been pointed out, because there were so many failures, who would ever think that the failures would be providential? But as I look at all those failures, he's been working with people, dragging them into the home. Lois is supporting everybody, and nobody's getting sober. But who stays sober but Bill? He's got to know that other domino piece before he comes to Akron. It all falls into place at the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel. So he knows that if he's going to stay sober, he's got to find another alcoholic. And he's going to choose, I think he's on guidance. And I can prove this to you in this story, how important the guidance is. He is going to go to the phone. He's going to put a nickel in the phone. There's about 3 stories. I'm going to tell the conference approved one. He's going to get 10 numbers. The last guy's Norm Shepard. And not one of those guys can help Bill. And again, providential. If one of them had helped Bill, we wouldn't have gotten to Henrietta, who's praying for Bob. We have to get to Henrietta. So all those people, thank God that he called. It's Mother's Day weekend. They're busy. The last guy, Norm Shepard, he's busy. He's packing to go out of town. And he said he gives Bill Henrietta Seiberling's number. And so Bill walks away from the phone. He's not going to call Henrietta Seiberling. He can't call the president of Goodyear's wife, that's who he thinks it is. He doesn't know it's the daughter-in-law. How do I know there's guidance, that Bill's under guidance? Because as he's walking away from the phone, he says in a tape talk that he gave, I heard a voice say to me, you better call that woman. My God, thank God he listened. Not only did he hear the voice, he was obedient to the voice. I believe he went back up to his room, and he actually calls Henrietta from the phone in his room. And here's what he didn't know, that every day she'd been praying for Dr. Bob in her prayers. He doesn't want to call her because he thinks she's the president's wife. And when he calls her, he says this to this high society woman, I'm a rumhound from New York. I'm a member of the Oxford group, and I'm looking for another alcoholic. And she thinks, manna from heaven. I've got just the man for you. Wow. She knows it's an answer to her prayer. So she calls Ann up. Ann, Ann says, Bob's not in any shape to come over today. So that these women are so persistent, they drag Dr. Bob with his hangover to see Henrietta and Bill the next day. You could just see these women behind Bob trying to help him through their prayers. By the way, that's a picture of Reverend Tunks there. And the call went through to the left of that door. I've been in that home. His office, when he was working on his sermon that day, is right to the left of that door. So here's a picture of the Gate Lodge, and we know that the two men are going to get together the next day. And I don't think Dr. Bob was too hungry with his hangover, but they're going to retire. And he doesn't want to talk to Bill. He just wants to give him 15 minutes, and they're going to retire to this little room here. And you can visit this little room today. Please come to Akron and visit it Founders Day weekend. It's a wonderful thing to go to that estate, and it'll be open to you for free, and you can visit. Anyway, you know the story. It's in the forward to the big book. The spark gets struck here. And Bill's no longer preaching. And you know what Bill says in the Mayflower of the hotel when he's so tempted to go into that bar? He then says, I needed Bob more than he needed me. It was Bob that was going to help Bill stay sober, whether he stayed sober or not. But it ended up that Bob was grateful to talk to another alcoholic, because Bill's going to say to him, I think this is the key phrase that changed everything, because Bob did not want to meet with another person to preach to him about his alcoholism and increase the shame he already had. But Bill says to him, hey, Bob, looks like you could use a drink. And I think at that point, it was one drunk talking to another drunk. So important and so missing from the Oxford group up to that point. So now we're going to enter this period, the flying blind. And I think this group is most interested in that period of time. So in this home is where the flying blind period will be taking place on Wednesdays. When they did that intervention, they're going to continue meeting at Wednesdays at 8 o'clock. And so for the next 4.5 years, Akron will be meeting in this home. Now, they're doing Oxford group, and they're doing prayer and meditation, which is a real important part of these meetings. But the newly sober guys can't sit still for that, just like you couldn't sit still to do step 11 when you started. They're jonesing. So Bob takes them into the upper room, and he gets the surrenders. He was the prince of 12 steppers. He gets the surrenders. Then they come down from there, and they join in refreshments and the social fellowship part of that meeting. But this group of alcoholics that are kind of surrounding Dr. Bob form another group inside the Oxford group, a subgroup. And they had a name for that subgroup. It's called the Alcoholic Squad. And also Ann Smith is going to work with the wives. She's going to form a group. This is before Al-Anon, and it was sort of like she's going to work with the families. She wasn't a co-founder of Al-Anon, but she's doing the same thing. She's working with the wives, and sometimes she would go either into the basement or the upper room and work with the wives. So there's a lot of work going on in this subgroup called the Alcoholic Squad, just for alcoholics. And we're using Oxford group literature. There's a literature table in that home, and we're using Oxford group literature. So let's take a look at the woman behind the other co-founder, Bill Wilson. Here you have Lois Wilson. Perfect wife for him. I mean, there's a new book that just came out on this marriage. I wish I had put the picture in of it. I'm sorry I didn't. Just came out. It's called A Marriage That Changed the World by Tom Adams and Joy. And it really gets down into the marriage that, because kind of like they turned their life and their marriage over to service to God. Both these marriages were in service to a higher power. They were partnerships, not just to the marriage, but in service to the higher good. Just a few pictures of Lois in her younger years, which you don't get to see. A lot of times you see a picture of Lois when she's kind of older and tired from her story, I think. But here's a beautiful picture of her, probably on one of their camping trips, I don't know. Here's a picture of her in a wedding dress. Now, a lot of you might think that Bill was driving that Harley with the sidecar, but it wasn't. It was Lois driving it when they went on their trips, and Bill's working out his stock calculations. She's the biker chick. There you can see her. One of the stories that Hallmark put out, it's Bill Borchart's film, When Love Is Not Enough. And it really takes you into the drama, to how difficult those times were, how very difficult it was to even survive the Depression. And before Al-Anon, poor Lois, not having an Al-Anon program, all the efforts that she put in to try to help her husband or tolerate his craziness. God, it's just a heartbreaking story. It's also captured well in the book. One of the things I told you, we talked about earlier, was these promises. These men didn't have a solution like we have today, but they wanted it. And they would make these promises and these pledges that they had. And here's a picture of the Bible, the Wilson Bible here. And he's writing to Lois. He says, "To my beloved wife that has endured so much, let this stand as evidence of my pledge to you that I am finished with drink forever." And that was written in 1928 by Bill. And we know in 28, he can't keep that promise. Then on Thanksgiving Day, again, a month later, he says, "My strength is renewed 1,000-fold in my love for you." 29, he writes, "To tell you once more, then I am finished with it. I love you." Breaks my heart. You and I both know he meant that. But lack of power was his dilemma. He could not keep those promises. Then he writes again in 1930, finally, and for a lifetime, "Thank God for your love." Heartbreaking. Another picture here of Lois. Here's a picture of her to Father Ed with gratitude. So Bill and Lois are going to end up in their home here. This is her father's home, actually, in Clinton Street. And it's there that Bill is going to be taking people in 1937 as well. And a lot of credit goes to these women because the woman's place was in the home. The men went out to work in the 30s, although Lois did work and supported Bill and the new people. But that was their domain. That was their job. You didn't bring drunks home to a home without checking with the woman. And I really think that's to their credit that any home opened up. So they traveled by train in those days, and Bill's going to come back to Akron, and that's when he's going. There's a picture of the National Rubber Machinery Shop. And he's going to, after he comes to the Gate Lodge and meets, Henrietta's going to do something else that you may not know about. He needs to see, he's broke, but he needs to stay in Akron to finish up the business deal. And she wants to keep him here so that he can help Bob. So she's going to move him into the Portage Country Club. But actually, this isn't a picture of the Portage Country Club. That's a picture of the house behind the Gate Lodge. So I've screwed you up a little bit here. Let me just reframe this for just a second. I guess I want to talk about the humble birth that takes place in that Gate Lodge. Take a look at the mansion that the Cyberlings are living in, but Henrietta isn't living in the big house. She's living in the little house because she's separated from her husband. But notice that the birth of AA did not take place in that house. It was a humble birth. And that also took place on Mother's Day weekend. So I bring out the fact that that's a special day in our history. Mother's Day weekend is the day that the spark gets struck. And I think of what a special day it happened on. How many children have been returned to mothers, and how many mothers have been returned to children as a result of that meeting in that Gate Lodge on that day. So Henrietta, as I started to tell you, is going to put Bill up to keep him in town in the Portage Country Club. Now, this is the wealthiest country club in Akron. All those rubber barons and stuff go to this country club. Hardly anybody lands in that country club, but Bill did. She puts him up there for 2 weeks, and I photoshopped him onto the golf course because I pretty much think if Bill could have played golf, he probably did. A little more about Henrietta Seiberling. She was raised at Vassar to marry at Vanderbilt. She was a very proper, very bright woman, very musically talented, and very classy. And she's ended up marrying a Seiberling. If you can go to that home, that mansion that I showed you, that beautiful English manor, when you're in town, you're going to get some beautiful history of this time period. There's actually a hospital room in that tower in there. And that's where she's going to give birth to her son, John Seiberling, who's going to grow up to be a congressman and who was also at those early meetings. Here's a beautiful picture of her. And there's paintings in the house of her. Just such a beautiful woman. Well, she's separated from her husband, but you know what? She never divorced him. She's got the kids, and she'd probably taken the kids back to Texas, where she was from. And so the family lets her stay in the Gate Lodge and raise her children. And actually, she would move to New York later on, and she would still come back in the summers and stay at the Gate Lodge. I'm going to let her share with you a little bit about what she thinks about AA in the early days.
We're not out to please the alcoholics. They've been pleasing themselves all these years. We are out to please God. And if you don't talk about what God does and your faith and your guidance, you might as well be the Rotary Club or something, because that's your only source of power.
I think you can see how strong she is in her faith. And she kept them on track. She didn't let them drift into views. Anyway, here's a picture of her in her later years. She turned out she was beautiful even in her later years. Again, she was in New York, and she would come back to Akron in the summer. There's a beautiful picture of the Gate Lodge back then, how it looked. Really well kept. Here she is in her apartment. And I was told that she had her Bible and she would chase Bill around in New York AA. When they leave the Oxford group in 1939, it's going to be Henrietta's going to come with us. She's not an alcoholic. She's part of the Oxford group, and the wives were part of the Oxford group. So in the early days, they were part of AA as much as the men were. Important to know that. So here's Ardmore as it looked early on. And here's some beautiful pictures of a very young picture of Bob and Ann. So they're just sitting in their living room. I don't know if that's a glass of something they're drinking or not, but I think Ann looks so beautiful there. I don't like a lot of the later years pictures of her, but I just love that one of her. So loving and so beautiful. And Dr. Bob looks young. Here's another picture of the couple here. Terrible picture though. Okay, and if you were to visit the home today, this is what you would see in the living room of Dr. Bob's home. This area has all original material artifacts. There's Ann Smith's Bible, which we're going to talk about, that she would read from, because you were talking about prayer meetings that Bob conducted. I'm not known that Bob conducted any meeting until 1939 when they leave T. Henry's home. It was Ann Smith that conducted those meetings, and sometimes Henrietta. And so on the mantle, you'll see pictures and pretty much all the original stuff, including the carpeting. And there were books on the floor everywhere because they didn't have iPads. They didn't have cell phones like we have today. They were reading. A lot of spiritual reading was going on during this time period. And that would actually influence the big book as well. So the Bible was what they read, or the Upper Room, which was a Methodist publication that came out just when we needed it in the very early years. In fact, it came out in the spring of 35. How perfect is that? But usually at Dr. Bob's home, they would read from Ann's Bible, the book of James, and she would close with two words: faith without works is dead, and God is love. Now, in the Oxford group days, those prayer meetings would start with the prayer, would then go with the spiritual reading, and then the group sat in silence with pen and paper. You would either do this individually or in a group, and you would be listening to what the Holy Spirit would say to you, and you would write it down. Then the group would share what they got. And then you would run it by the four absolutes, which is all we had. There's the main step work back then was 4 words: honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. Dr. Bob said those were the only yardsticks we had until the big book got published. And then we had the 12 steps in the big book. So Akron's using those 4 words, but to understand those 4 words, you need to understand the 4 questions that you asked yourself if you're going to measure your behavior. And those 4 questions are: is what I'm about to think, say, or do right or wrong, true or false, ugly or beautiful, and how does it affect the other guy? And that way you could discern if your guidance, where was it coming from? Now, Ann Smith would then, that's how the prayer meeting went, or it's how the Oxford group meeting went, the quiet time meeting. But then afterwards, she would call people up, like Henrietta Dotson for over a year and a half. She called Henrietta Dotson every day and asked about her quiet time, because you see, in the Oxford group, they had partners. Today, very similarly, we have sponsors, but the Oxford group had partners, and you would go through your quiet time. You would share that message that you got with your partner. You did not go it alone. And you would run it by those 4 words. So the telephone sitting there is so important to what was going on as well with this thing called checking. It was a part of this system where you checked your guidance. Now, the Oxford group was still with us. We were with them, they were with us, and they would check us to see if we were maximum or not. We didn't like that very much. We kind of pulled away from all their checking on us and taking our inventory. I guess they thought they were helping us. By the way, you see an ashtray there because Ann had started smoking in her later years. And that's a Goodyear ashtray. That's an original table and an original lamp. And Ann Smith is kind of, she's also working as a sponsor. Bob's working as a doctor, but she's at home and she's helping any way she can. And sometimes that's, she had a workbook. She had her own little journal. It wasn't really a diary. It was more note-taking of the materials they were reading, and that she was kind of organizing them in the form of a journal, which I think has been published by Dick B. But also the house is in the process of publishing her original one, so that you don't have it chopped up. You just can read it for yourself as it was with her. And so she called it spiritual pablum. So I guess she's like the mother of AA, feeding the souls that would come to her for this spiritual pablum. So both Lois and Ann were heroines in my mind, because they're inviting these drunks into their home during a depression. There's not a lot of food. Sometimes there's no food. Sometimes if they had a potluck, it was just potato dishes. This is out of the darkest times in our country's history, a light comes in. That's just amazing to me. And both Bob and Bill felt that was providential, because it brought people together. People needed people. They had to help each other. There's beautiful stories of how they helped each other. They clothed each other. They fed each other. Well, they're bringing people into the home, and the first guy they bring in is not Bill Dotson, because they never brought him in. It's Eddie Riley. I don't know how many of you know about Eddie, but he's important. Eddie comes in, and they bring he and his wife. They've lost their home and their 2 children, and they put him in Sue's bedroom. Now, Eddie's a handful. Eddie's nuts. Eddie's going to slide down the drain pipe and try to throw himself into Lake Erie. Bill and Bob had to go up and fetch him. And he kept running away. There's a Grapevine cartoon on a story about Eddie in the Grapevine. And it shows Bob and Bill running down the street to catch him because we didn't know enough about how to do a 12-step call. So they're practicing on him. How do we give it away? Here's our first guy. We know we got it. We got to work with someone to stay sober, but how do we help get him sober? So they're still working that out. Well, Eddie's wife was staying up in Sue's bedroom, and she was told by the Oxford group to disclose her indiscretions. So she did, and he beat her up. And she came down to the breakfast table the next day, black and blue and pretty roughed up. And I've talked to his nephew, and he said that's when we get when to do so would injure them or others. That's certainly a great story from that story. So finally, Ann Smith is going to fix him a tuna fish sandwich for lunch. And Dr. Bob thought maybe he had an allergy to tuna fish because he's going to grab a knife and he's going to take a butcher knife and he's going to chase Ann through the house with it all the way up into her bedroom, we believe. And she's going to be down on her knees praying every prayer she knows, including the Lord's Prayer, when Bill comes in the nick of time and grabs that knife. But those are the kind of experiences they were having. And Lois had experiences like that too. One of them even kills himself in their home. They go out of town, the guy sells their clothes, they come home and he's gassed himself in their house. So when we're talking about the women right now, and they're bringing in these people to sober them up, because it's not really treatment centers, we're kind of using City Hospital, but mainly these people are being sobered up in homes around Akron, and especially Bob and Ann's and Bill and Lois's. So tremendous courage from these women to do this, to keep their husbands sober. And both Bob and Bill will tell you that AA men have a special knack for choosing really good women. I don't think you'd have AA today without Ann and Lois. That's why it's really good we talk about them. And before there was Alcoholics Anonymous and there was this group, they were really a big part of the group as well. So now we're going to talk about Bill Dotson. They had to let Eddie go, but let me tell you one little quick story about Eddie because I'm on a roll. Eddie shows up at Dr. Bob's funeral, and Smitty's standing next to Bill, and Smitty gives the elbow to Bill and says, "Isn't that Eddie over there?" And so they ended up finding out that Eddie was sober. And I found out later that Eddie got sober in Youngstown, Ohio, and he died with 17 years. And he had become part of the National Council on Alcoholism. So you see, the seed got planted. And when they let him go, they learned something really important from him. You can't wet nurse a drunk. So that's an early lesson that took place at Dr. Bob's house. So they're going to move on to Bill Dotson, and he's quite a mess. And behind him is his beautiful little wife, and her name's Henrietta. And Henrietta, another prayer is going to come into our story. You know, there's the prayer of Henrietta. There's the prayer that's said in Dr. Bob's, in T. Henry's living room. But there's another prayer coming in here. She's upset with her minister, and she calls him up. "You aren't reaching him. I'm going to find someone who can if I have to see everyone in Akron." She prayed with the pastor of another church that someone her husband could understand would visit him in City Hospital. Do you believe that? That prayer totally got answered, because Bob's going to call up the hospital and he's going to find out that they got a live one tied up in there. He's a councilman in Akron. He's an attorney, but boy, when he drank, he was crazy. So he's tied up in the hospital. But one of the things they did in the early days was they worked with the women. You approach the wives before you approach the husbands. So he's going to tell her, the little woman, meaning Ann Smith, wants to see you at the house. So Henrietta goes up to the house, knocks on the door, and says, "Hello, Mrs. Smith." And Ann immediately, in all her humility, says, "Oh, no, honey, Ann to you, my dear." And then later on, she invites her in and she tells her, let's just you and me stay in the background. And, I like bringing them out now. It doesn't hurt their humility, but it allows us to see a bigger part of the story because they were just, Ann Smith, just humble as it comes. In our Akron Intergroup office, we have a display here on Ann showing her notebook and a simulation of a coffee pot and the upper room and some of the books. But I'm going to let Ann Smith, the only recording we have of Ann Smith, is here, and I'm going to play it for you if she's willing to talk. Let's see.
Robert wants me to start first. He's afraid. So we've got Betty and Smitty here with us, and George Hood. We're all up in my bedroom where we are entertained now. Very formal entertaining, as you can imagine. It was very nice of you to invite both Bob and myself down to Bedford Hills, and we'd love to come. But at present, I imagine we'll have to stay put at 855 Ardmore. This is a new experience for me. I had a moving picture taken of myself, and now I'm recording. So you see, even with a bum eye, I'm still alive and kicking. Here's Robert.
What a precious sound. I've always, till we got that wire recording, I'd never heard her voice. It was so sweet to hear it. She's got cataracts. She has cataract surgery, and it went bad. So she's blind in one eye and she can barely see out of the other, but she didn't want to have another surgery. And so why you see that dress in this bedroom here, where the recording took place, is so I can tell you an important story about Ann Smith. Depression times, there wasn't much going on in terms of shopping, and somebody had given her 2 new dresses. Now, the wife's role in the early days was to try to keep the husband sober and keep him busy. So they're in charge of refreshments and all these parties and fellowship dinners and dances and floor shows and all this stuff, picnics and everything that they're doing. The wives are heavily involved. And she gets 2 new dresses. And Dorothy Snyder's talking to her and she said, "Oh, Ann, which dress are you going to wear to the dance?" And she looks at Dorothy and she says, "Oh, I couldn't possibly wear one of my new dresses. Some of the wives may not have new clothes." So Ann Smith's going to put on one of her old dresses just because she's not thinking of herself. She's thinking of others all the time. So I love that story about her, and that's why that dress is on the bed. Now, Ann did the morning quiet time and was very good at it. It's almost psychic how good she and Henrietta were, so that God can move them around. If every day you get up and you turn your life and your will over and you ask God for guidance and you do the practice that they did, that's what created the story. God could put them where they needed them. Well, this morning, Ann's doing her quiet time, and she looks at Bob, and they were getting ready to either go out of town or do something. And she says, "Bob, we can't go. Someone's coming." She had revelation, and she had a knowing from her practice. Sure enough, Archie Tobridge shows up on their front porch, sick and looking for a cure, and they bring him in. Now, he was so sick that after a week or 2, he thinks he's going to take his life because he's overstayed his welcome. Ann Smith does the quiet time again, and she picks up on this. So she approaches Archie, and she said, "Look, Archie, as long as we have a home, our home is your home." Archie Tobridge is going to stay with the Smith family for 10 and a half months before he's well enough to go back to Detroit, and will eventually start AA in Detroit, where we almost had our international that got canceled during COVID. But I used to love to tell that story because I thought we were all going to be in Detroit, and I was going to say, now you know how AA got to Detroit. Anyway, his story is in the book, The Fearful One, and also The Man Who Mastered Fear. And he says, "I've been taken off the streets and nurtured back to health by Ann Smith." We don't have good records because they didn't keep records back then of how many people came into Akron to get the cure, stayed with the Smiths or other homes in Akron that opened up. This wasn't the only home. And then they would be nurtured back to health by given the principles of the Oxford group. They did not have steps back then. They had those 6 tenets that Bill wrote and took some of the principles and wrote them into 6, then expanded them into 12. But at that time, it's pretty much they're giving them prayer and meditation. They're rehabilitating them through feeding them and caring for them and detoxing them. You know, people got detoxed in Dr. Bob's home with the Caro syrup and the sauerkraut and the stewed tomatoes, if you can imagine that yummy thing, and formaldehyde. But that's what they were doing. They were running halfway houses and treatment centers in Akron. And the movie hasn't really been done about Akron, but there's a lot of stories about what others were doing as well. If you just focus on Bob and Ann, you don't get the whole story. Anyway, I think we're going to have a repeat. I think I have a bad slide here. Let me see. I don't think I want that again.
Robert wants me to start first. He's afraid.
I don't want that.
So
Okay. We're going to talk about Ernie G. So who's Ernie G? There's actually 2 Ernie Gs. This is the first Ernie G. He's the 4th man in. And I'm going to put behind him Dr. Bob's daughter, Sue. Sue's going to marry Ernie. And she really had another boyfriend. His name was Ray, but Bob and Ann didn't like Ray. And they did all they could to keep her from seeing Ray Windows. Ray Windows, not very, coming from a high-class family. His father was an alcoholic and a custodian somewhere. So they didn't want her with him. And they were madly in love. And so she was always running away from her parents. So Bob decided to interfere on that. And he gave Ernie, the 4th guy in, some money to take her out to a show and buy her a burger. Well, it must have worked because she ended up later on breaking up with Ray and marrying Ernie. And it was a terrible marriage. But I knew Sue, and I knew her pretty well, actually. And so here's a picture of Sue with her daughter Bona and her son Mickey. Behind her is her, looks like he has maybe, I don't know, looks like a cigarette in his mouth. I don't know. Anyway, that's Ernie behind her and his son. And then, and his last name is Galbraith, because the woman holding the child there is Mama Galbraith. And Mama Galbraith, the families, not just the wives, the families are part of this early movement as well. And so she is going to go get this Methodist publication, The Upper Room, buy it for a nickel, and she's going to go to all the homes that are having these meetings. Now, not like AA meetings at the time, but these Oxford group meetings are in some of the homes, and she's going to drop off the upper room. Now, the Oxford group, when they came to your house, would look in the bathroom to see if it was open to the right day. That was part of their checking on us and taking our inventory. So if you go to Dr. Bob's bathroom, you're going to see an upper room on the wall. So here we have Ray Windows, who she ends up marrying later. After his wife dies, he comes back to Akron, and she's divorced Ernie. And the 2 of them get back together. And that's when we purchased the house. The 2 of them were part of that. And so that's a little love story I threw in for you. The one thing about Sue is she would, here's some of the other people that opened up their homes as well. Wally and Annabelle G and Johnny and LG were also taking people in because they called it the cure back then. They thought they had a cure for alcoholism, actually. So people are flying in. As word of this is coming out, people start coming to Akron to see Dr. Bob and to get the cure. So other homes had to open up as well. Dr. Bob has an office downtown in the Second National Building. It's still there. And it's like a intergroup office at his office. I mean, it's headquarters. Bill's got headquarters in New York. The office here is headquarters in Akron. Well, let me tell you about the first 13th step. The first 13 steps going to take place in his office. And a gal by the name of Lil, one of the early women who were trying to get sober through what they were doing, is doing the wild thing on his operating table in there. And she's doing it with the, Dr. Bob, the Good Old Timers said some mayor. So I don't know if we had a recovering mayor on the program. Anyway, they're crazy. And so they send Ernie up to fetch him. And Ernie comes in, and as Ernie G comes up to get them out and bring them to Dr. Bob's house, she grabs a bunch of pills and she swallows them and she tries to jump out the window. So they were able to pull her back and to get her back to Dr. Bob's house, and they had to clean her up and get her ready for her family to pick her up. This really set women back in Alcoholics Anonymous. After that, Bob doesn't want to work with women anymore. You know, they have this program, but women could upset it. This is basically for men at the time. There's no, they're not having good luck with women getting sober. So that's the first 13th step, and that's why Dr. Bob and Sister Ignatia would not work with women. So our story's starting to take in some dimension of what it was like for women back then. Plus the stigma on women was terrible. We were considered prostitutes. We were considered loose women, and the wives weren't too happy when we showed up. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So here's St. Thomas Hospital. There's Sister Ignatia. And a woman does enter the picture in 1939. We've run out of places. We've worn out our welcome at City Hospital. And Bob is going to approach Sister Ignatia. She's at the admittance desk, and she loves Dr. Bob, and she's going to start sneaking people the first one was into a flower room. Now, his name was Walter Bray. Can you imagine? He comes out of a blackout and he's in a flower room in a hospital. He probably thought he was in the morgue. We owe Sister Ignatia probably the origin of what we have as medallions today. Only the nuns were making these Sacred Heart badges. That was part of what they did. And so she would give the men those when they got released from her program. And they were supposed to bring them back to her if they wanted to take a drink. So there you go with the medallions. Here we have a picture of her at the admittance desk there. Sweet little thing from Ireland. Tiny, handling all those drunks. And here she is shaking her fingers at him as she developed the ward later on. And they'd say to her, "Oh, sister, please pray for us." And she said, "Go pray for yourself. God loves to hear from strangers." So we just love that line from her. Another picture of her. And here she is. She's going to speak to you now a little bit about her, and she's going to mention Ann Smith.
This group or any alcoholic should often say a prayer for Ann, because she was the backbone of this. In her calm, quiet way, she was really an angel. I would call her and say, "Oh, Ann, I'm so worried about this fellow." She knew most of them from either reputation or doctor telling about them. And she would get the doctor if it was anything serious, but otherwise she said, "Now don't worry about it," because they have a they're alibiologists, in other words. And I learned they do anything to promote another drink or treatment of some kind.
You can see she really knows alcoholics. She calls us alibiologists. I love that word. Oh, thank you, sister. Now, in the ward, we ended up in 1950, before Dr. Bob died. We have this bronze plaque. I think it's an AA Comes of Age. You'll see pictures of it in some of the conference-approved literature. And the plaque used to hang at the where the chapel was. Well, first, I think it was upstairs. Now it was at the chapel. The Friends of Dr. Bob and Ann Smith affectionately dedicate this, what am I talking? Memorial to the sisters and staff of St. Thomas Hospital. In Akron, the birthplace of Alcoholics Anonymous, St. Thomas Hospital became the first religious institution to ever open its doors to our society. May the loving devotion of those who labored here in our pioneering times be a bright and wondrous example of God's grace, everlastingly set before us all. Oh, is that beautiful? Well, they tore down St. Thomas Hospital last year. The chapel came down about a year before they tore down the building. And as they were dispersing the materials, they gave this plaque to us, and you'll see it at Dr. Bob's home. Please come to Akron and read this beautiful plaque that hangs next door to Dr. Bob's home. Not sure why the slide doesn't want to turn. Oh, here we go. Okay, now I didn't want that to go that way. I wanted to go back, if it will go back there. Now, Sister Ignatia and Dr. Bob are going to work with close to 5,000. I think exact number is 4,800. And it's going to be a very active place where we're going to keep that ward. We're doing a lot of 12-step work at Akron. I mean, really, it's the cradle of AA. There is so much 12-step work going on in Akron that went into the writing of the book, because the experiment is all happening, so much of it, about 80% of it in Akron. And I love this picture of the bridge that's going over to what was once St. Thomas Hospital. And you can imagine how many 12-step calls carried people to the hospital over that bridge. Well, in 1952, the Catholics are going to have their way with Sister Ignatia. And she's going to be moved to Cleveland to start a treatment center in Cleveland at St. Vincent's Hospital. But on the morning when she was leaving, the old timers lined their cars on this bridge in the early hours, put their headlights on, and stood outside their cars to escort her to Cleveland. I used to almost tear up when I would tell that story, because it's just how much they loved her. This is incredible how grateful they were to her, those men that got sober under her care there. And a couple of them, they would be shaking, and they would go into their wallets and they would pull out that Sacred Heart to show me, and they would cry as they were sharing it with me. And when they dedicated the street in front of that hospital in Cleveland, that was also called Rosary Hall Sanitarium, which have Robert Holbrook Smith's initials in it, they were going to dedicate the street Ignatia Way. And they used to have a sign on this street called Dr. Bob's Way. But anyway, when they went to go christen that street in her name, they had a big formal gathering. And one of the old timers there grabbed the microphone and said, if the Catholics don't canonize her, the Protestants will. I remember that. So where the ward was, there was a chapel. And so sorry, this is all we have left of the chapel is going to be these photos. That, and there is a museum downtown Akron where some of the stained glass, beautiful stained glass windows are. And the other pieces are in storage because they've split the museum up, and another half is going to go to St. Vincent's High School in Akron. So because some of it's consecrated for Catholic, like the altar and stuff like that. So anyway, but for a long time, this chapel was an AA chapel. It was the holiest place that I've ever been to. The Stations of the Cross were on that chapel, where Sister Ignatia took Bill through the Stations of the Cross, and she'd often play from the choir loft. The choir loft was above, and it emptied out into the chapel. And so all the patients would come in there and say their first prayers. And often Bob and Bill came to this chapel, and the center mosaic above the altar is of the Good Samaritan, which couldn't be more perfect for an AA chapel. It just, all the words in the stained glass windows pertain to the work we do in AA. And it just was so beautiful. It broke my heart when they tore it down. Okay, so we're now, I'm not sure why we're back. I guess we're still talking about Flying Blind period, because in 1939, the book is going to come out. That comes out in April, and in May, Cleveland's going to break away. And they have the name of the book is already Alcoholics Anonymous. But Clarence says, well, We have the book now. We don't need to keep coming back down to Akron. And we'll call our group AA from the initials of the book. He then called himself the founder of AA. So we're going to leave T. Henry's home not until late 39 of that year. And about 75 people are going to leave and come into Dr. Bob's home. So why don't you want to turn? Excuse me for just a minute. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we're going to go into Dr. Bob's home, and Dr. Bob is going to be in the Dr. Bob's going to be in the dining room. He's going to be at the head of the dining room table where they wrote the big book, and he's going to introduce himself as an alcoholic. He's going to put his foot on the rung of the chair, and he's going to begin reading from Sermon on the Mount from his Bible. And if you visit Dr. Bob's home, there's that table, there's that chair, and there's open to Sermon on the Mount from his Bible. Now, there's quite a few people jammed into that home. I imagine the wives came with the husbands as well. And they're very crowded. They don't know where they're going to go. So they're only there for a couple weeks, because by January of 1940, they're going to move into King's School. And this is when the format of the meetings will change. Up until that point, up until that meeting with Dr. Bob, where he actually introduces himself as an alcoholic, is probably the beginning of a change. But those were the only meetings, if you think of meetings, that were held at Dr. Bob's house. From the alcoholic squad into Dr. Bob's home, now becoming Alcoholics Anonymous, and moving into King's School, where there was a little bit of a different format. And I think that's when you really get before there were testimonies, but the testimonies were really to what God was doing for you. They weren't so much, well, I'm an alcoholic and here's what it was like and what it's like now. That thing comes from the big book, and also was incorporated into King's School at that time. But there weren't regular meetings at Dr. Bob's house. There were just these quiet time prayer meetings, but not AA meetings. The first meeting like that would have been in 1939, the end of 1939, as they're on their way to King's School. So we're going to talk about the wives here for a minute. They washed the dishes. They made the coffee. They cooked all those great pies and pastries and things, donuts. And women sat on one side of the room and men on the other. It was really not for women. Their purpose was in the kitchen. And Anne's part of the meeting was the refreshments. But the thing about Anne is, she was such a nurturer. God, this woman, she went from table to introduce herself at her part of the meeting. And she said, I want to welcome you and your lovely wife to Alcoholics Anonymous. We hope you will keep coming back. When you say keep coming back, you can just say a real quick prayer to Anne, because we say it all the time at our meetings. And that came from Anne Smith. And she never forgot anyone's name. By the way, we took the Lord's Prayer from the Oxford group into Dr. Bob's home and into King's School. And we still say the Lord's Prayer at King's School. Dr. Bob donated a Bible there and his signature's in it, along with Bill Wilson and Bill Dotson. If you visit King's School this Founders Day on Wednesday, you can see it. Wednesday at King's School at Founders Day is hundreds of people that stand up individually and introduce themselves. It's the best part of the meeting. I don't want you to miss it. So yes, so Anne Smith, by the time somebody introduces me to somebody, I've forgotten their name, but Anne Smith was so focused on other people, she never forgot anyone's name. A little bit more about her. She was a medium build. She battled with her weight like the rest of us. She was quiet and timid. She was unassuming. She was a lady. She had a great sense of humor, as did Dr. Bob. A melodious laugh, but a chain smoker, and she started at 56. She was loving. She didn't criticize, didn't judge, accept. It's coming. Extremely tolerant, deeply loyal to family and AA. Could rise to great heights, though, if she thought AA was in danger. Yep, she would speak up then. And she was ready to do battle with anyone who threatened her family or Alcoholics Anonymous. I kind of like that about her. I got a bit of a warrior in me too sometimes. She was unselfish. She would not spend money on herself. No personal sacrifice was too great. Again, they sacrificed their lives for the good of the program. And she was an embodiment of the four absolutes. She served to steady Bob and Bill. As Henrietta said, she was the rock. And Bill knew that. That's why he called her the mother of AA. Because that's just when they were just starting out, and she was there for all those quiet times and group consciousnesses that formed the program. Bob would say of her, how my wife kept her faith encouraged in all these years, I'll never know. If she had not, I know I would have been dead years ago. If you ever get to see the play, the Broadway play on Bob and Bill, you'll see the roles of the wives. And as I saw the play for the first time in Boston with the playwrights, I saw it, and I almost wanted to stand up in intermission and say, what are these women doing taking all this from these men? It was so hard. And then I realized if they hadn't stayed, and it wasn't easy to leave men during the Depression. So that was also another reason. If they had left, we wouldn't have the program. One of my favorite sayings I want to share with you about what Ann Smith said, make a great t-shirt. If I don't love you, what is wrong with me? Wow, that's a keeper. So the role of the wives in the early days that you're interested in were that they sought help. They helped with the meetings. They opened their homes. They did the 12-step work. They were part of AA. They called to get men to visit patients at the hospital. They worked on the directories. So they were kind of the organization while the men did the 12-step work. Now I'm going to introduce a non-alcoholic, Ruth Hawk. She's a woman who played a very big part in our development, but she's on the New York side here because she's the secretary of honors dealers. We hire her for that company, but she never saw too many car products being sold at honors dealers. That's Hank and Bill's little program there, that little company they started. Bill's the salesman, Hank's the boss, she's the secretary. And she said she never saw too many products getting sold. She saw a lot of people down on their knees making surrenders or passed out. So she didn't know what she was getting herself in for. Also, they had no money to pay her. So they were ripping off stock certificates that they had for selling the book that were worthless at the time. They were selling them for $25. And even though they couldn't back that up, they rip her off one a week as her weekly ration. And she was a really, really good secretary. And she's the one that will type up the manuscript of the book and work with Bill's dictation. So she was the right girl for the time. And there's the stock certificate that they gave her. And
as I said, I think I was a very good secretary, and I didn't like the various jobs I had at that time. And for one reason or another, I'd simply tell them I was quitting in 2 weeks and do so. And I was always able to get a job. Of course, it was Depression times, and you didn't work for much. But I actually came to them through an agency. I had contacted an agency for a secretary, and that's what I thought I was doing at the time.
So little did she know that one day the book she was typing would save her daughter's life. Lori just died a couple years ago of COVID, but she was a dear friend of mine. And when I gave the big book talk for the first time in Toronto at the International, I had her stand up when she had about 30 years of sobriety at that time when I came to this part of what her mother did. So you see, we never know what we're doing here that's going to help somebody down the road from us. And I just lost my talk, so let me see if I can get it back. Where'd it go? Son of a gun. Hold on. Desktop. I don't know why that happened. Okay, here we go. Huh. Oh, there it is, right? Can you see it? Okay. There we go. Came back. Didn't know if it would or not, but okay. Okay, so we owe Ruth, because as she's working as the secretary, she gets an obit of the Serenity Prayer, and she decides to send it out to the groups. And it later became the AA prayer, right? Wasn't originally written for us, but we use it all the time now, daily. There's the typewriter that she used. Imagine typing up that manuscript copy a couple times on a typewriter. I can't imagine that. That thing drove me to drink in college. So you can find that typewriter at the archives at the New York office. And here's that dining room table where they held that meeting that I talked about. It's the original table where they wrote the stories for in the big book. 3/5 of the stories came from Akron. And the typewriter that Sue used to type up those stories is also on that table with her husband's story in it, Ernie, the 7-month slip. When the big book comes out, Bill's going to write a little note in it to Lois, an inscription, and he writes, "To Lois, one whose loving care and fortitude in our dark days together made these pages possible. So to her, this first book of the first edition is lovingly and thankfully given, Bill." And this was in memory of the first Christmas. Well, we might as well talk about Clarence while we're at it, because he had a woman behind her that played a part. She got him to come down and see Dr. Bob. Now he's going to start AA in Cleveland. And there's his wife, Dorothy. So she bought him a bus ticket and she went and saw his minister. And when Eldrick Davis articles came out, it's an important part of history of why the thing took off in the Cleveland-Akron area, because in 1939, Eldrick Davis is going to write a series of articles in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Now you've got about a dozen people sober in Cleveland, including Clarence, when these articles get written, which brings in up to 500 people. That's when your beginner classes will start, and the women are going to be involved, and Dorothy's going to be involved in coordinating all that. Can you imagine yourself, a dozen people sober when 500 people come in? Just think about that. That really goes, by the way, Clarence's story is Homebrewmeister in the big book.
This, and some of you may know Clarence of Cleveland, who was had so much to do with starting the Cleveland AA groups. His wife had a sister in Bronx, New York, and she had come to visit the sister and had met Bill. And she called Bill up and said she was in town and she'd like to see him. And he said, "We're up at Cornwall, come on up, you know." And I must say that, like most men of good taste, Bill liked pretty girls too. And Dorothy was a lovely, warm, just humorous, full of humor, full of laughter person, and he liked Dorothy very much. So there we were, the four of us, and I had never met Dorothy before, but we immediately developed a perfect rapport, as though we'd known each other all our lives. And after we had done the stint for the day, she and I shared a bedroom, and we were talking away, and this must have been 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. There was a knock on the door, and it was Bill. And Bill couldn't sleep. Hank was sound asleep somewhere, but Bill couldn't sleep. And we had coffee sent up, Dorothy and I. So we were in a room with one big double bed. So Bill just got right in the middle, and there we were. And we talked the rest of the night, the three of us, in that position.
Don't you love that story? So you see, Dorothy's actually a part of them taking the manuscript copy of the big book to Cornwall Press and helping doing the typesetting. So she was a pretty important character as well. And now Clarence was one of the few people who were instrumental in helping to bring women into AA. He argued strongly for their inclusion into the fellowship when they were often unwelcome. Now think about that. Women unwelcome in Alcoholics Anonymous. There was a time where we weren't welcome. We were a threat. Many of the older male members of AA felt about women that they were nothing but trouble. Even Bill and Bob were scared of them and the trouble they often caused with the old bucks, said Clarence. Walter, who was the first guy to be put into St. Thomas Hospital, had a wife named Marie. His story is backslider. And she was asked by Bill to write a chapter to the wives, which she did, but it never made it into the first edition. I think yeah. So what about women? We were going to call this thing 100 Men. And then Florence Rankin got sober and she said, you can't call it 100 men. You got to call it 100 men and one woman. So she was our first sober woman that makes history here. Her story is a feminine victory. But in 1939, she returned to drinking and died of an apparent suicide or pneumonia. There's a little bit of a discrepancy in what she actually died of. And she went to help Fritz and ended up not making it. So the first woman to become sober in AA was this woman named Jane, and she is listed by Dr. Bob with 12 months of sobriety, dating her entrance into AA. But again, she disappears. So we don't really know what happened to Jane. And that was 37. And here's a picture of Florence. Here's her grave. But she played an important part too, as this story develops. Now, here's a character I really love, Sylvia Kay. So Sylvia Kay is going to come by train from Chicago with her secretary, Grace. And Dr. Bob doesn't want to work with her. He says, we have never had a woman and I will not work with a woman. So he's going to send Sylvia up to Cleveland, and it's going to be Dorothy Snyder, the wife, that's going to work with Sylvia. But so she stayed for 2 weeks with the Snyders, then went back to Chicago by train. And she may have had a slip there, which is why there's some controversy over sobriety, who's the first one and all that, because she ended up taking some little pills. Dr. Bob's daughter told me that. But when she got back to Chicago, she sobered up and helped Earl Treat a lot with Chicago AA. And she was really attractive and she was very wealthy. She ended up down here in Florida in Sarasota, but I wish somebody could dig up some information about her down here, but we don't have too much more. But her date is September 13th, 1939. And it was Keys to the Kingdom is her story. Yeah, here's Grace, non-alcoholic secretary that came with her. She's going to start the first AA intergroup in her apartment in Chicago when they return. There's another unsung hero here. First intergroup. Now we've got Bobby Berger. We're starting to find out about Bobby. We never talked about Bobby. We didn't know about Bobby. It was hidden for many, many years until Gary ran across quite a treasure trove of information on her and just recently came out with a beautiful book on what was going on in the 40s. And it tells another story about women. There's no women around to sponsor the women. And Bobby got sober in 1942 to 1948, and she would be the secretary in the office during the time that the Saturday Evening Post comes out. And she's typing on those old typewriters, answering all these letters from around the world, wanting information on Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill's not in the office. Bobby's running it. Bobby, in my mind, is Bill Wilson at that time. She's covering for Bill because of his depression, and she's doing what Bill would be doing. She was called the National Secretary of the office, and she worked herself almost to death. I mean, it was an incredible job answering 6,000 inquiries that came in.
I did, and none of them made it, but she did. Her name was Bobby. And Bobby Berger later became the secretary of what is today GSO. where she worked for many years and where her name became known to AAs all over the world because she was the one who corresponded with them. And this was the gal I said couldn't make it. Well, I was pretty glad she did make it. And it wasn't very long after that one of her 12-step calls turned out well.
By the way, that was Marty Mann talking about Bobby. And here's the book I told you about. Title of it is Bobby B, The Untold Story of AA's Fantastic Communicator. It's really a beautiful story about who she was, but also so much history of 1940 that we almost lost. She had a kind of a sad ending, so that's probably why we didn't talk about her much. But again, with all the historians we have in AA now, digging up things, we're finding out so much more about the early pioneers. So she's the one that typed up all those stories from the Saturday Evening Post. And when I was in Australia and New Zealand, I asked both countries, would it be fair to say that Bobby Berger sponsored your country? And they all said yes. From the letters she wrote, the literature that she sent, and the teachings on the traditions that she shared with them, she actually was really nurturing them in their early years. And she was well loved all around the United States. She traveled, and people just loved her because she was the main person at the office. Now, we know from Bill White's book, Slaying the Dragon, that there was a tremendous stigma on women alcoholics. I need hardly say how much we all know that the stigma around a woman alcoholic is much greater than anywhere else. Our languages say boys will be boys, but there's nothing that says women will be women. It's much harder for a woman to admit to alcoholism than it is for a man to admit to it. Therefore, the death rate from alcoholism percentage in women who have alcoholism is higher than it is in men that have alcoholism. Now, that is in his book, and I don't know if that's current today, but it certainly was, even back when I got sober in 78, there was a stigma. And there was a lot of closet drinkers and women that didn't want to be known, because when most women came in with the label nymphomaniac. And again, the wives didn't know when we came in. The wives didn't talk to me when I came in. They're sitting with their husbands still in Akron AA in 78 at King's School. They're still sitting with their husbands because they want to make sure that any woman who comes into AA doesn't get him in AA. And so I was considered a threat. And I didn't see myself as a threat, but I think they might have. So we're going to talk about Marty Mann here for just a minute. There's kind of so close between Marty and Sylvia as to who the first woman was. But Marty didn't keep her sobriety, so her sobriety broke. But she did get sober maybe an inch before Sylvia, but they're both so close, it's hard to tell. She relapsed during her first 18 months of AA. She started the National Committee of Education because what she wanted to do, because of the stigma that I just talked about, the stigma against alcoholics, we were like the scum of the earth. There was no cure. We were dying on the streets and in insane asylums and in jails and nut houses. We were, this is a new society that's being formed. And she wanted to educate people to the fact that it's a disease and to break the stigma. Now, when she came in, she gets the manuscript copy from Dr. Tebow. She's a patient of Dr. Tebow's. And she looked up where Bill Wilson was, and she went to that meeting at Clinton Street, and ended up, Bill Wilson became her sponsor early on. So she's very, very early and did a tremendous thing because she wanted to change the alcoholism from a moral problem into a health issue. So she played her role well. So here's a little film for you.
Alcoholics Anonymous and other organizations combating alcoholism are gaining ground, bringing to the public a sense of the true nature of the problem through such spokesmen as the director of the National Committee for Education on Alcoholism, Mrs. Marty Mann.
Alcoholism has too long been a taboo subject, just as tuberculosis used to be 40 years ago. We're trying to teach people the truth, that alcoholism is a disease, and that because it is a disease, it should have no stigma attached to it. Alcoholics should be dealt with like other sick persons in hospitals and clinics, not in jails. Alcoholism, America's fourth greatest public health problem, can be solved by community action. The National Committee stands ready to help your community plan such action.
Science has not yet fully explained the inner mechanisms of the problem drinker. But today it has been demonstrated through experience that the sympathy and understanding of one alcoholic can help reclaim another, and that in such brotherhood lies many an alcoholic's last, best hope.
You think you're sunk. You think you're through. Well, you're not. You may not be able to help yourself. There are plenty of us to help you. You really want us to.
Time marches on.
Come on. Still waiting for that to change. Okay, so that's a really nice glimpse into Marty. And here, meet Ethel. Now, for a long time, Akron thought she was the first woman in Alcoholics Anonymous. I found out doing this research that she wasn't the first woman. You see what they did in the early days is they put an adjective in so they could claim a little fame for themselves. I mean, you know, a little notoriety. So they said that she was the first woman with continuous sobriety. You're looking at a picture of a woman who was the first woman whose sobriety did not break. And that's Ethel. And her story, she came in 1941. Her story was from farm to city. First woman to get sober in Akron. She had a husband, Roscoe, and he was a skinny little guy, about half her size. They say that was like Mutt and Jeff. And she started the first women's group. And I think she's going to speak.
We started at King School, which was the only group then. And we went there religiously for a year. We never missed a Wednesday night. And I just loved every bit of it. At first I thought that the wives would look down on me, and they didn't. I just can't ever fail to give the wives so much credit. They were such a help to me, and I thought that they'd say, well, oh, they say she's one of those things too. But the only thing that was said, and not in unkindness at all, they turned me over to Annabelle Gillum, and she says, well, I understand you drank too. And instead of resenting it, I said, yes, that's what I'm here for. And we saw several different people that we knew.
I just love that. She talks about early days at King School. Okay, going to the West Coast now. Here comes Sybil, Doris, Adams, Stratton, Hart, Maxwell, Willis. C. I guess she'd been married a couple times. Sobriety date, March 23rd, 1941. She's now going to read the Liberty and the Saturday Evening Post, and she's going to find out about Alcoholics Anonymous. And she's going to write to New York, and she's going to get an answer from Ruth Hawk, and she's going to be sent to her first meeting in Los Angeles. So I'm going to let her tell the story about what happens when she goes to her first meeting and they've never had a woman. So they don't know what to do with her. And I'll let her tell you what happens to her.
Continued by saying, if there are any women here, they must go. And he meant me, I thought, because I didn't see any other women there. I didn't see any other women there. It turned out there had been a couple, sitting over kind of at the side, and they were non-alcoholic wives. It was simply that those good fellows there had had a closed meeting for a couple of years, and if a couple of the wives or 3 or 4 of the wives came down, they just wandered outside and sat on the Davenport and talked about their husbands or knitted or exchanged recipes or something, because there was no Al-Anon, no program for them. And I guess he spotted these 2 women over there and said, as is our custom, will the women please wait outside and come back in for refreshments? But it was just as good as throwing me out bodily when he said, "The women go." That was me. That was all. I was so self-concerned, so I left.
Okay, but wait till you hear what happens. She calls New York again. They call Mortimer Joseph and they warn him that there's a woman coming. They alert him to that. They don't warn him, they alert him. And so when she comes back, they're so excited to have this woman now because they had a stack of letters to give her from people who were answering, women who wanted help. So let her tell it. I don't know why that's not working. It's not working either. Come on.
He got down to the last stack with a big rubber band around it, about 50. And he said, "I've been saving these to the last because they're all from women. And we have a woman alcoholic now, and her name is Sybil. So come on up here, Sybil. I'm putting you in charge of all the women." So, boy, I got promoted in a hurry. I was thrown out last week, and now I'm in charge. So I tottered up there, and as I told you last night, I said, I can't. Why can't you?" I said, "I'll be drunk next Friday. I always have been. Won't be any different unless.
I just love that. Just love that early story. So a little more about women, Oxford group women. 2 listeners, anonymous, would get up and do that quiet time, and they would write what they got. And then along comes A.J. Russell, and he is going to edit that book. He was an Oxford group guy, leading author. And so he compiles it into a book called God Calling. Now, Richmond Walker gets sober in the early 40s, and he takes that book and he takes each page and he writes a 24-hour book, prayer book, and a meditation book for alcoholics from that book. So there were 2 anonymous women behind that. Got to give them a little credit. Oh, you'll love this. Okay, this isn't the real picture of her, but it's to go with this statement. She was the first woman to sponsor in Akron. If she sponsored you and you got drunk, she'd pick you up and slap you around. And then she'd tell you if you did get sober, you were going to get some more. So there's some early sponsorship for you. I think it's hilarious. Here's a sad story. It's about Irma Lavoni. And this is to tell you what it was like for women in the early days and how frightened AA men were of the early women. There was a letter that was written by the same Mortimer Joseph that I talked to you about. And he's a big leader in LA. And he addresses this to her at a meeting of the executive committee. So they had executive committees of the Los Angeles group of Alcoholics Anonymous. We held December 4th of 41. It was decided that your attendance at group meetings was no longer desired until certain explanation and plans for the future were made to the satisfaction of this committee. This action has been taken for reasons which should be most apparent to yourself. It was decided that should you so desire, you may appear before members of this committee and state your attitude. This opportunity will be afforded you between now and December 15th of 1941. You may communicate with us at the above address by this date. In case you do not wish to appear, we shall consider the matter closed and that your membership is terminated. You see, they had these committees back then, and they operated in this way. Needless to say, Irma Lavoni did not make it in Alcoholics Anonymous as a result of this. Well, let me introduce you to the no woman rule. This is down in the South, in the Little Rock area. They actually had a rule, and there's documentation on this, because there's the Little Rock plan. I'm not going to get into that, but there's a plan. And along with that was the no woman's rule. You were not allowed to work with another woman. Can you believe that? Also, there was this Frances P., and she was from Fort Smith, and she wanted in AA so bad that she said that she would be like Lady Godiva, and she would ride down Main Street half nude if they would let her into Alcoholics Anonymous. These are all true stories. if you'll just let me in. You're going to get a kick out of this, and I'm glad we've made it to close to the end here, but the Grapevine is going to come out with this article in one of its very first editions when it was the big newspaper kind of thing. And a woman wrote this. I don't know if she was alcoholic or not. I'm thinking she might not have been, but this appeared in that Grapevine. The percentage of the women who stay in AA is low. Many women form attachments too intense, bordering on the emotional. So many women want to run things. Oh my goodness. Too many women don't like women. Women talk too much. Women are questionable help working with men and vice versa. Sooner or later, a woman on the prowl sallies into a group on the prowl for phone numbers and dates. A lot of women are attention demanders. Few women can think in the abstract. Women's feelings get hurt too often. Far too many women in AA cannot get along with the non-alcoholic wives of AA members. Here's another magazine. You don't see this around anymore, but we have a copy of it. I'll be happy to show it to you if you come to Akron. Anyway, the title of the magazine is called Confidential. And one of the articles in that said, Alcoholics Anonymous, no booze, but plenty of babes. So you can see women had a really rough start in Alcoholics Anonymous. They threw them out in Cleveland. The wives did. The wives did not want AA women in the program. In our area, it was a little tough. Not all the wives, but some of the wives. And that was particularly true in Cleveland. Anyway, here's Nell Wing again, the woman I started off having this talk with. And she's going to tell you what it was like when two other minorities tried to come into AA, the gays and the blacks, I believe. So here we go.
There were two groups of people that, three groups, young people, gay people, and women who really had a hard time finding a home. Let's face it, AA in very early days was a gentleman, forgive me for saying this, but it was almost a gentleman's club. We'd had experience very early on with women and guys and, boy and girls, it's shenanigans. And that especially in Akron, Dr. Bob took kind of a dim view of all this. And so it was a little suspicious and whatnot. I think about the first women's group was about 43 or 42 in Ohio, Cleveland, somewhere's there. But they had a very hard time. I remember women coming, just like in those early days in the Washingtonians, the women's wives groups of Martha Washingtons took in and sheltered and helped alcoholic women that they had because the men wouldn't do it. And so there were a lot of categories that made AA had to kind of open its doors in many, many different directions. And they did indeed start it. I can remember, of course,
So here's the bedroom, Nell's bedroom at Stepping Stones. Women were the dominant force behind the AA Grapevine. Marty Mann was a part of that and did all of the early work of the General Service Office as they continued to conduct much of that activity today.
But from a New York headquarters, one of the most dramatic jobs in combating alcoholism is being done by the voluntary organization called Alcoholics Anonymous. AA offers help freely to any alcoholic anywhere who is willing to admit his own inability to help himself. And though not a religious organization, its 12-step program calls for belief in some power outside the individual. Direct contact with those for whom help is asked is made only by AA members, who themselves have gone the long road from alcoholism to sobriety.
You can see all the women that were working in the office at that time. And of course, here's a picture, we're closing now, a picture of Ann Smith. We will lose Ann Smith. You know, the Smiths are only part of this program for 15 years compared to Bill and Lois. Ann Smith is going to pass in 1949. This is the last picture taken of her before she dies. And you can see here the picture of Dr. Bob. He's not well, and he's going to follow her in November of 1950. If you visit Akron, there's the grave of Dr. Bob and Ann Smith. And on Founders Day weekend, there was a special memorial procession there, which is for some people the highlight of the whole weekend. You know, there's motorcycles, but there's cars and there's buses, and the graveyard fills up with tribute to Bob and Ann, and there'll be a speaker there. And then the most amazing thing that they do is they have a bagpipe player who plays Amazing Grace, and people sing it first and then they hum it. And it's a very emotional tribute to both of them at the grave. You know, when Bill comes to Akron for the last visit, and we lost Ann, and we were gonna build a monument befitting a co-founder and his wife, and Bob gets down on the floor and opens up that diagram of that monument, and then he looks up at Bill and he says, Bill, let's just you and me get buried like regular folks. And so there's that humble grave I just showed you of Bob and Ann, but even a more humble one of Lois and Bill that's in East Dorset. Sister Ignatia's grave, she died in 1971. Ethel Macy's grave, we do have 2 services in Akron, one for Bill Dotson and one for Ethel at Founders Day. If you come in on Wednesday, you could attend either one of those. We don't want to forget them either. And the coolest thing, Henrietta's not buried near Akron, she's in Kentucky. But her son once said at a gathering that we had, he says, you know what it says on her tombstone? Let go and let God. Look how simple that tombstone is, and look what the words are on that tombstone. So I'm going to close with a statement from Maya Angelou, and I spelled I think Angela wrong. Anyway, somebody corrected me on that. Anyway, the reason why I think this is so important, and if you get a chance to talk to a woman that's come in before you, I think a lot of women died. I think there was not the hand of AA for everybody, and I'm not so sure how comfortable they felt if they were a threat in any way. So my hat's off to all the women with long-term sobriety, and I often talk and interview them, and they'll tell me how hard it was. They'll tell me what was going on. And I always thank them because it's the tough broads that stuck around and kept the doors open for us. And this is from Maya, and this is because in this story, these are men and women who went before us. And when we cast our bread upon water, we can presume that someone downstream whose face we may never see will benefit from our action, even as we enjoy the gifts sent to us from a donor upstream. Thank you for allowing me to share this talk with you, the whole talk, and really show how far we've come as women in Alcoholics Anonymous, and the full story of it wasn't, you know, it wasn't all that easy in the early days. Thank you.